Hello, my name is Dr. Onsby Rose. I'm the Director of Instrumental Activities at Dordt University in Northwest Iowa. For about the next 45 minutes, I'd like to talk to you about successful concert programming. You're currently listening to a performance by the United States Marine Band of John Philip Sousa's Semper Fidelis. Often we find that wind bands are drawn to lots of newly written music. But we all know that our students need a steady diet of all types of music. This makes them a well-rounded musician as well as properly educated. With that in mind, throughout my career, I have struggled with trying to find the correct balance of music from newly written music to all of our wind band classics. I've tried to find a way to keep myself balanced in programming. Although there's many different ways to think about programming for each concert, I have found that there's a very simple method for me to go by that has allowed me to balance my programs throughout my career. It allows me to choose music from our newest composers all the way to the classics of wind band literature. Also, it ensures that I don't leave out much of the music that the band as we know it was built upon. This method I call old, new, borrowed, blue, and a march. Before we get started, let's discuss the learning outcomes, those things that I would like for us all to be able to achieve by the end of our session today. To begin with, I would like for you to be able to identify and describe, have a knowledge of what these 5 programming classifications are that I've spoken to you about: old, new, borrowed, blue, and a march. Some are self-explanatory, some require a bit more depth of thinking. Next, I'd like you to be able to take any given work that you are familiar with and assign that work within a primary, probably a secondary, and on occasion a tertiary category. So you can take either the old category and figure out if that fits, what piece of music fits in that, and maybe it's an old piece of music, but it's also a borrowed piece of music. We'll talk about that a little later on in the presentation. Also, I'd like you to be able to assess literature choices and be able to create that balanced program using this method of old, new, borrowed, blue, and a march. And finally, as a group, we will complete, or you will complete on your own as you watch this, a potential concert program. I'm going to have you writing some things down so that at the end of this presentation you have a basic idea of what might be going on, what you might be able to do in order to program and go through this method of programming. To get started, we'll need to go through each of the classifications that we have outlined. I'm going to give you a bit of information, a bit of a description of what I believe each of these categories entails, and then I'm also going to ask you to write down some ideas of music that either you have conducted or played, or that you would like to conduct with one of your ensembles as some ideas to help build what will be a final representative program at the end of the presentation. So if you don't already, if you could grab a notebook or a scratch sheet of paper that has fair enough room for you to write 10 or 15 literature choices down on it, and have that next to your computer as you watch this video. So to start off with, let's talk about the category of something old. It sounds pretty self-explanatory, but what is something old? How do we describe old music? Is it only music that was written 100 years ago? What makes a piece fall into the category of old? Well, the first descriptive thing that I use in order selecting music in the old category is that a general way of thinking about it is that something old is music of composers that are no longer living. Now, this isn't always an accurate way to describe this. For example, I'll use David Maslenka as a representative of this. He passed in 2017, so maybe some of his music might not be considered old, although he's currently no longer with us. However, there are composers that, for example, Claude T. Smith, that has passed on long ago, that probably would fall into that older category. However, just using this as a generalized idea of something old, it generally comes from composers that are no longer living. Next, we can also look at melodies from the past. There's a wonderful work written by composer Frank Kelly called Loch Lomond that was based on an old Scottish melody. And with that melody is many, many, many years old, although the composer is currently living, as well as the work was written within the past 15 years or so. However, the basis for the composition is using a melody that is old. So that is yet another way to classify as something old. Also, something from previous decades. I mentioned Claude T. Smith earlier. Much of his music was being played when probably many of us were coming up through high school band programs in the 70s, 80s, and maybe even early 90s. And all of that music was written a number of years ago. And an example of that would be Claude Smith's God of Our Fathers, written well over 20 plus years ago. That's another generalized way of saying this is something old. Again, to balance that off, we'd spoken about David Maslanka earlier. Much of his music in his early compositional days were written much more than 20 years ago as well. So these, again, are just generalized. There's no delineation, there's no line of demarcation where you can say that a song or a piece goes from being new to being old. It's just a general way to look at it, of meaning what could we think of as old music? Music of composers that are no longer alive, music based upon melodies of the past, and music from previous decades 20 plus years ago. So what I'd like you to do at this time is to pause the video, and I'd like you to take that blank sheet of paper that you have with you, and I want you to write down three works that either you have played or you would like to play or you'd like to conduct with one of your ensembles that you believe falls into the something old classification. Go ahead and do that now. Okay, now that you've got those three works from the something old category down, let's talk about our next category, something new. So the great thing about something new is that we as wind band conductors, we have the upper hand. Wind bands in our current world are almost to the point that they can be considered new music ensembles. In the past 30 plus years, numerous composers have begun writing for the wind band, and some quite good artistic music has been created. So we have a large body of music to choose from in this category because of that. Also, most of our concert attendees, whether it be parents or community members, whenever they show up at a band concert, they expect to hear music that may be unfamiliar to them. This is drastically different to our orchestral colleagues in that they feel the necessity, and rightfully so many times, to program music that is very well known, like a Beethoven symphony or a string serenade by Dvorak. With the wind band, although we can have, and we do have, those types of literature, we also have all of this new music, a much larger body of new music, and therefore our concert goers expect to hear music that they may not be familiar with. When we talk about the something new category, we're most often talking about currently living composers that are writing music right now. We've spoken about Frank Kelly previously. Other examples of this would be Julie Giroux, John Mackey, Stephen Bryant, Randall Stanbridge, and I could list literally tens of probably into the hundreds of wonderful composers that are currently writing music for the wind band medium or for some combination of winds, brass, and percussion. So that's really the beginning jump-off point, is the living composers. So also another way to look at this, with the old category, we said a generalization could be music written 20 plus years ago. With the new category, our generalization here is music written within the previous 20 years or so, even if the composer is deceased. So we spoke of David Maslanka. His most recent work before his passing was his 10th Symphony, and although that was only written in a couple of years ago, we wouldn't consider that old because the composer has passed. So again, these are generalized ideas, but most often old music will probably fall in 20 plus years ago, and our new music falls within the most recent 20 years. So again, I'd like you to pause the video now, and I want you to, below your 3 old selections, I'd like you to write down 3 works that you believe fall into the something new classification. Go ahead and do that now. All right, great. Now that we have those 2 categories covered and you have some ideas for the something old, something new, let's take a look at our 3rd category, which is something borrowed. So that has some connotations that you probably associate with it as being borrowed. Probably the biggest one for wind band performers and conductors is orchestral transcriptions. We all know that the wind band really was built upon orchestral transcriptions. Composers, transcribers began to take music that was written for the orchestral medium and transcribe that into the instrumentation for what we consider the modern wind band. This is how composers began to learn what the wind band was capable of. They could hear these colors, they could hear what the combinations of instruments do, and it gave them the ability to think, well, maybe I can write a new piece just for this wind band medium. So orchestral transcriptions are very important to the wind band as a whole. However, if we allow ourselves to, we can get caught up in thinking that borrowed music is only from the orchestral medium, and that's absolutely not true. There are many other areas that we can consider borrowed music. Just to give you an example of some, let's look at some other borrowed options. For example, the O Magnum Mysterium, transcribed for wind band by Robert Reynolds, was originally a choral work by Lauridsen. That's a wonderful work that has become very much a standard and often played piece within wind bands across the world. Next is Toccata and Fugue in D minor, the Bach organ work. Again, a work that was transcribed for band a number of years ago that works very well, but was originally not written for the wind band medium. Another, and this is a unique one, in that it's Irish Tune from County Derry. Yes, this work was written originally for the wind band. We could probably classify it as an old piece because it's based on an old tune, and it's also written by a composer that is currently deceased, but it was written using a folk tune. So we borrowed that folk tune, the Loch Lomond by Frank Kelly that I mentioned earlier. This could also be considered a borrowed piece of music because it was written using folk music or a borrowed tune. And this is something we'll discuss later on, is that many of these works can fall into multiple categories. You just have to use this as a way to balance, and that's the reason we have those options for multiple categories. And then finally, a piano work that some of you may be familiar with is the Shostakovich Opus 34, number 14 in E-flat minor, a work that has been often played and sometimes has gotten forgot about, but is a wonderful work for the wind band medium that was originally a piano work. So at this time, again, go ahead and pause your video, and I want you to, in this 3rd category, write down 3 works that you believe fall into the something new classification. Excellent. Now we have our 3 categories. Let's go on to category number 4, which is something blue. I always enjoy talking about this category because it's such a wide-ranging category. There's so much that can fall into this. Just to begin with, normally your blue piece is probably going to be a slow piece. It doesn't have to be. To use another example from Frank Kelly's literature, Blue Shades would be considered a blue piece, and it's not slow at all. There's some melodic things in it, but it's mostly an upbeat, pretty exciting tune. However, most often than not, it's going to be something slow, something like the John Mackey Hymn to a Blue Hour. In addition to that, it's could relay sadness. When we think of the color blue, many times that's associated with being sad or being melancholy. Those things fall into this blue category. In addition, many people will probably think of jazz. Jazz being very closely associated and using the blues scale, and it absolutely could be that. Using that to Kelly piece again, Blue Shades is built upon lots of jazz harmonies and different things that create that jazz sound. So something blue could also fall into the jazz category. Many times you'll find that it's in a minor key. Your blue tune is something that is written in E flat minor. We mentioned the Shostakovich piece in the previous category. That could also be considered blue because it relays somewhat of sadness. It's written in a minor key. So the blue category is very wide-ranging. The advantage to this when I'm programming and I'm looking to put literature together is I usually wait until last in order to program my blue piece, if you will. Usually because that's what I use to balance the program out. I can look at everything else that I have going on the program, and I can choose a blue piece that balances that program out. Maybe I'm doing, as my old piece, I'm doing the Shostakovich piano transcription, and I don't need another slow work, so I choose a work that will fill that blue category that helps spice the program up, and I choose something that's more upbeat, that is written in a jazz idiom, or that is exciting but in a minor key. It's a very wide open category so that you can use that in order to balance your program out. So again, as I mentioned, most often I choose this work after I've programmed the other categories. So now, again, stop the video. I'd like you to write down 3 works that you believe would primarily fall into the blue category. And next up is truly my favorite category, and that is a march. Something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue, and a march. The march is a wonderful piece of music. It is one of the major building blocks of the wind band repertoire. As we spoke earlier, transcriptions are so important to the wind band. They gave composers an idea of what could be done with a group of winds and percussion. The march is very much the same way in that composers began writing for these. They were functional. Sousa wrote marches. They're originally written to march troops with, but then they became an entire genre upon themselves that truly is only done in the way that we know them by wind bands. Orchestras can play marches, and they can play them well, and they can sound good, but a group of winds and percussion is what really is the center focus of the march. Also with marches, you should try to think outside of the box. There's a couple of ways to do this. First off, we can think of other nationalities. The march is a very nationalistic piece of music. When people hear the name John Philip Sousa or hear a march by Sousa, it automatically brings to mind America, the U.S., United States of America, because that is the nationality that Sousa was associated with, and many of his marches were written on patriotic ideas based on that country. In addition to that, though, Kenneth Alfred, a British composer, considered the British March King, also very nationalistic music. There's more than Sousa, there's more than Alfred. These other nationalities that we speak of, German, Russian, French, we could go on, Czech. Every country has generally had someone that has written marches, or multiple people that has written marches that are nationalistic to that country. There are also marches that are marches, but they're not really marches. And those are things that we need to think about. Some of the nationalities for the marches you see here: a Russian march by Agapkin, a Slavic farewell. The Fuchik, well, you're probably familiar with his entry of the Gladiators, Kenneth Alfred's Vanished Army, and Sousa's Semper Fidelis that we heard earlier. But then there are those marches that are marches, but not really marches. March to the Scaffold by Berlioz. The March from Symphonic Metamorphosis by Hindemith. Those can also fill this category of marches. I think the most important thing to be discussed with marches is that many times currently marches get pushed to the back. There's so much wonderful new music out there for us to play, and there's so much great old music as well, that many times we feel that we can't put that march on there, but it's such a crucial part of the building blocks of the wind band repertoire, as well as our students just need to know march interpretation. They need to be able to play a march and play it in the way that it was meant to be played. So exposing them to that, but yet exposing them to these different nationalistic marches, as well as some artistic music that falls into the march category, but it's not a traditional march in the way that we think of it. So again, another pretty large category that you can use in order to fill your program out, give some variety, as well as a huge amount of educational opportunities for your student musicians. So again, for the last time, I'll get you to pause the video, and I want you to write down 3 marches. But of those 3 marches, I'd like you to choose one that is mostly familiar to you. Maybe it is a Sousa march. I'd like you to choose one that maybe comes from another nationality, and then that third one, try to think of a march that isn't really a march, but it is a march, something similar to the ones that we have outlined here on the screen. So go ahead and pause, and we'll be right back. So next up, I want to talk to you about the rubric. So this is the written down form that I use in order to program concerts. Now, what we've talked about today is old, new, borrowed, blue, and a march, 5 categories. There's going to be situations in which you program more than 5 tunes or less than 5 tunes on your concerts, but you can still use this rubric in order to write down your works, place them in categories so that you can see if your program is balanced, whether you have too many new works, whether you have too many old works, and so forth. So first, let's talk a bit about the categories of the rubric. So first, on your left, you see the literature programmed. The first thing that I would do is I would write down the literature that I have chosen to program on my concert. So if you were going to take the tunes that you have selected for these categories, you might choose 1 tune from each of the 5 categories and write them down. They don't have to be in a specific order. I usually attempt to place them in whatever I feel is going to be concert order. So that's the literature program. Then your primary category. The primary category is going to be the category in which you feel that they most properly fit within. So whether that be old, new, borrowed, blue, the march is pretty easy to place that in a category. But whatever one, because as you'll see as we continue this discussion, many of the works will fit into multiple categories. But what category do you think that it falls in primarily? The secondary category. Most oftentimes, all of the works will likely fall into a secondary category. They may not, but it's very, very possible that you'll think, well, that piece is old primarily, but it's also borrowed because it was transcribed from a choral work or something along those lines. So the secondary category is still crucial, and then also a tertiary category. Less often will you find that works fall within that third tertiary category, but it does give you that option to place some things out there that maybe it does. For example, you could choose a work that was written more than 20 years ago by a composer that was deceased. Therefore, you feel that it fits into the primary category of being old. But then in addition, you realize that it's an orchestral transcription, so that also tells you that that is a borrowed piece of music. And then finally, last but not least, maybe in addition to being old and being borrowed, it's a slow work that's in a minor key, and it's a blue as well. So I always give myself that option that if I feel that it does fit within a third category. I put that down there because, as you'll see shortly, when you look at all these, this is how that you, again, look overall at your balance. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to use a concert that I programmed for a group that I was conducting back a couple of years ago. I'm going to show you the literature, and then we're going to go through how I classified each of these and came up with what these works were and how it balanced my concert. So we have Procession of the Academics, which is a wonderful work by David Maslanka, Three Airs from Gloucester by Hugh Stewart, Chorale and Allegro, which is an unpublished Nellie Bell piece, Simple Gifts, Four Shaker Songs by Frank Kelly, The Vanished Army by Kenneth Alfred, which you probably can already tell that that's our march, and An American Civil War Fantasy by Jerry Billick. All of these are relatively well-respected and often played pieces. Some of them have fallen by the wayside. You don't hear the Billick as often anymore, as well as the Nellie Bell is unpublished. Hopefully it will be published soon. But let's look at what I classified as the primary categories for this music. Now, this is the order in which we performed each of these pieces, so that's the reason that it's in this order. And let's see at the categories that I put in it. So the Procession of the Academics by David Maslanka. At the time that I did this concert, David was still alive, so he was a currently living composer. And although this work was written a fair bit ago, it was written for a ceremony at Illinois State University, I still felt that it was primarily a new work. It was written at that time within the previous 20 years by a living composer. So that seemed to fall easily within the new category to me. Next, we have Three Airs from Gloucester by Hugh Stewart, a wonderful grade 3 type piece that's very playable by middle school bands and high school bands, that has 3 movements and is just a great piece that can expose your students to some various different types of playing. I classified that as old. Hugh Stewart is unfortunately no longer with us, and the work was written in excess of 30 years ago. If I recall correctly, it was written in the mid-50s. So that's a relatively old piece of music. I felt that that was very viable to classify that primarily as my old piece. Next is Vaclav Nellie Bell's Chorale and Allegro. Most of you probably aren't familiar with this work because it's unpublished, but it is in a minor key. It has some very angry sounding things to it because of that minor key. So I placed that in my blue category, and I actually chose that work, as we mentioned earlier on in the presentation. I slipped that work in there last. I actually chose all of the other works first and then slid the Nellie Bell in there because I felt that that balanced out the programs. Simple Gifts, Four Shaker Songs by Frank Kelly, new. And you'll see this one definitely fits into multiple categories, but I felt at the time that it was a relatively new work. Frank obviously is a living composer and newly composed, a wonderful, great piece, so I classified that in the new. So now if you look at what we're seeing here, we've got new, old, blue, new. So with just those 4 tunes, my balance isn't very good right now. I have more new music than I do anything else. But as you'll see as we continue through these category placements, how everything tends to balance out. Okay, of course, The Vanished Army by Kenneth Alfred. That one's an easy one. That's a great British march. That is wonderful to play. It's got some challenges to it. And then finally, last but not least, we closed our concert with American Civil War Fantasy by Jerry Billick. And I classified that as a borrowed piece because it's a conglomeration of numerous Civil War tunes that were not originally, they were originally sang. Some of them were spirituals, some of them were tunes that soldiers sang while they were out in the battlefield, and it came from different areas. So that one I felt primarily falls in the borrowed because it has so many different melodic ideas that were borrowed from other mediums. So if we just look at our primary category now, we see that we have 2 news, an old, a blue, a march, and borrowed. As I mentioned before, most often you're probably not going to do exactly 5 pieces on a concert, so this is one of those situations where I programmed 6 works, so obviously that primary category is going to be doubled up. So I doubled up on the new in this one, which, we could look at that in various different ways. As I mentioned, we do have a tendency to play some, a fair amount of new music as wind bands. But I felt by looking at just the primary category at this point, that was relatively well balanced. I have something from every category that I feel is primarily falls in that category, and I do have 2 news. So this is the reason that I like to go ahead and classify secondary and tertiary categories, because then that gives me an even deeper view into, is this program balanced? So I'm not going to go through separately for each of these ones, but I'm going to bring up what I classified each of these tunes in if I felt that they needed a secondary classification. And as you see here, Procession of the Academics, I did not place a secondary category. I probably could have. Chosen that to be. It actually could be a march almost, but it could be an old tune as well, especially if I were to program that now. I do think that that piece is over 20 years old, but at the time that I did this, I felt that new was really the only real category that fell into. 3 Airs from Gloucester. You can see here the secondary category is blue. If you're familiar with this piece, the center movement is a very slow, very emotionally written movement. And I felt that lended itself to the blue category, that it gave that tinge of blue to the concert. Chorale and Allegro by Vaclav Nelibel, old. Easily seen there because Nelibel is a deceased composer, and the work was written at least 3 decades ago. Chorale and Allegro was actually a work that was found in the bottom of a box in the Nelibel archives in New York, and a good friend of mine, Kevin Richardson, edited it and is in the process of having that published currently. Simple Gifts, the Tekeli, Borrowed. Again, that one easily falls into that because the piece is built off of shaker songs. It's built off of folk tunes that were borrowed from the vocal, the singing that they did at that time, and Frank used that as a way to structure and build this piece. But yet it's still a new piece. The Vanished Army. Yes, it's a march, but it's also old. It's a piece that was written many, many years ago. So it falls into that old category. American Civil War Fantasy. Also, again, an old piece. Jerry Billick was at the University of Michigan and wrote this work while he was there, and it was written in excess of 30 years ago, so I classified that as an old piece. So now we get a little more depth into the balance of our programming. Now we have 4 olds overall. If you look at both categories together, we have 2 borroweds, we have 2 news, we have 2 blues. So we're a little heavy on the old right now, but we can see now with the new and the borrowed that it's beginning to show that it is balancing out some. So next, I go to my tertiary category and see, do any of these fall into additional categories that would help me see my balance? So let's take a look at what I felt the tertiary category for these works are. So as you see, I only classified 2 that I felt would have a third category. Chorale and Allegro by Nelibel, I actually classified that as new. And you probably look at that and think, what is he thinking? He has it classified as old. How can it be old and new? Well, the reason that I said that is because although it was an old piece written decades ago, it was a blue piece because of the things that we discussed that places music into the blue category. It's a newly discovered work. At the time that I programmed this, I think this was the 2nd or 3rd performance of it. So although it was written long ago, it's new to us. It's new to our ears. So I felt, that does fall into the new category, even though it was written quite a bit ago. Simple Gifts, 4 shaker songs, blue. So we have new, borrowed, and blue for that one. So you look at that and why is it blue? Well, one of the movements has those things that lead us to look toward a blue piece. The whole piece is not blue, but some of the work falls within the blue category, much like 3 Airs from Gloucester has one movement that falls within that blue category. So you're never going to probably come out with these being to where that you have 3 news, 3 olds, 3 borroweds, 3 blues, and 3 marches. Definitely not 3 marches. But you will be able to look at this, and if you have something jumping out at you that there's a ton of 1, then that tells you maybe I need to step back and see what I can change about this to better balance the program. Currently we have, it looks like, 3 news, we have 4 olds, we have 3 blues, we have 2 borroweds, and we have our march. Usually you're only going to end up with 1 march because you'll classify that march as your primary category, and then if it falls into secondary or tertiary categories, it's going to not fall into the march category again, obviously. So although there's only 1 there, generally looking at the balance of this, I believe that it generally balances out. We could probably find a tune that maybe falls into a secondary or tertiary category that's borrowed, but it's new, to give us, a little bit more borrowed on there. Or we could not have as much old, so we might change a tune out that falls under a different category, but doesn't fall under a second or third category that's old. But in general, if you look at this, we have all of our categories covered, and there's nothing that's overly weighted on one or the other. In other words, we don't have 6 new category rankings up there. We don't have 5 old category ratings up there. We generally balance it out within a couple of having a little bit of each: old, new, borrowed, and blue. So now it is your turn. What I would like you to do is I'm going to change the screen in a moment and show you a blank rubric. And I want you to program a concert. Throughout our discussion together, during the description of our programming categories, we've outlined these, and you've selected 3 works for each category that you feel falls primarily into that category. So I'd like you to use those lists, and I'd like you to program a concert. So here is your rubric. This is our created concert that we are creating separately but together. So using this rubric, I'd like you to go through the works that you've chosen and select at least 5 works, 1 from each category, that will primarily fit into one of those categories. So old, new, borrowed, blue, and a march. Those are your primary categories. Place those in your literature programmed, and then define those in your primary category. Once you finish that, then I want you to take a look at the pieces you've programmed and see if they fall into a secondary category. If they do, go ahead and place those categories in there. And then finally, also do the same thing once you've placed that secondary category in the tertiary category. Once you've done that, then I want you to go back and look at that, similar to the way that we looked at the program that I just illustrated for you, and see if there's anything out of balance. If there is something out of balance, then go back to your list and see if there's another work that you can put in that would give you better balance. Again, we're not looking for you to come out with 3 old, 3 new, 3 borrowed, 3 blue, and a march. We're looking for a general balance to see that there's not an overabundance of old, or an overabundance of borrowed, or an overabundance of new. Again, you're likely only going to have 1 march. However, if you think about it, there's certain pieces that you could also classify in a secondary or tertiary category as a march. The billet that we spoke about has some march sections in it. We could have classified that as a march also. So anyway, now at this time, take another sheet of paper or the same one that you're using, make yourself a rubric here like I've got on the screen, and hit pause, and I want you to go ahead and program your concert. So first off, I'd like to thank you so much for listening through my presentation today. Hopefully it has been helpful to you in some way, and going through the process alongside me has shown you a little bit more depth in how that I think about concert programming. As I said at the beginning of the presentation, there's so many ways to do this, and many of you probably have methods that you have used in the past. My only effort with this is to give us more tools in our toolbox, another way to look at things, a way for you to look at your programming and the way that you've done it, and maybe check that against each other. It's always great to have these checks and balances. The most important thing, though, is that we are music educators. We are music teachers, and our primary responsibility is our students. Our first thought each time that we choose a piece of music should be what is best for the education of those musicians in our ensembles. We're so unique in the fact that we get to choose our own textbooks. Every other educator within our buildings most often has a textbook dictated to them that this is what the school system expects them to teach out of. Band, orchestra, choir directors are unique in the fact that the music that we choose is our text. So choosing that textbook is such an important task. We want to make sure that our students are well-rounded, that they're exposed to all styles, from marches to waltzes to all of the different genres of music, as well as just making sure that our audiences, whether that be parents or whether that be others that come, are happy with what they hear. If we play all new music, people may not enjoy that. However, if we get them there and they hear something that they do enjoy, whether that's a march like the Stars and Stripes Forever that they can tap their foot along with, that newest John Mackey piece that's out that may not be as pleasing to their ears because their ears are not used to those sounds, it may open their eyes to those things. And the same thing is true for our students, and even more importantly so there. So again, thank you for watching this. I appreciate your attendance and your listening to this. If you have any questions at all or you'd like to discuss this with me further, I encourage you to reach out to me. You can email me at onsby.rose@dordt.edu. That's right here along the bottom of the screen. And shoot me a question, and I'd be more than happy to talk with you. If you disagree with me, that's great too. I'm always open to other opinions. I'd love to hear what you have to say, because we're all growing as educators, we're all growing as musicians, and we can only do that if we're open to the things that others have to tell us. Again, thank you so much for watching my presentation today. I hope that it has helped you on some level. Please feel free to reach out to me at any time, and I hope to meet you in person sometime and wish you the absolute very best for the remainder of your summer. Please send me any questions to the email you see on the screen, and have a blessed summer.